Hello and welcome to the Wargamer, and you're joining me for another Blood Bowl painting tutorial. This time I'll be showing you how you can paint the Orc players in the colours of the Gouged Eye, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. Here we have the Orc thrower that I'll be painting as part of this tutorial, and as you can see I've primed it using a grey spray primer. This is because there's quite a few bright colours on here. The reds and the greens will really stand out a lot more if you use a lighter primer, but I'm not going to use white because it's just a little bit too light. Now the first task in painting this miniature is going to be painting the skin areas, so this includes obviously the arms, the hands and also the face. And we're starting off with a base coat of Deathworld Forest, followed by a highlight of Straken Green, before washing over the miniature with Athonian Camoshade, and then applying a final highlight of Nurgling Green. So using the Deathworld Forest, we want to get a nice and even base coat across the miniature's skin. As you can see here, I'm going for a slightly lighter orc skin tone rather than this quite dark one that we normally see. I want to have a little bit more of a natural skin tone on this miniature. So I've mixed in some water in with the Deathworld Forest, and this will really assist us in painting over these areas quickly. It will give us better control over the paint itself. And then once this first layer is dried, we're going to be applying a second layer over the top, and that will give us the best coverage possible. With the base coat completed, we now want to bring the colour up a little bit, so I'll be using Straken Green mixed with Athonian Camoshade for this. Now I've mixed them in roughly equal quantities, and this will create a really nice watered down Straken Green. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be applying this over the surface of the flesh, but I'm going to be leaving the darker green visible in the recesses still. We only want to pick this out on the raised sections, and this just really gives some nice depth to the skin, as well as lightening up the skin tone as well. Following the Straken Green, we now have a slightly lighter skin tone, but we still want to enhance some of the depth of colour and also bring out some of those details as well. So I'm going to be applying a wash of Athonian Camoshade across the skin. Now I've mixed in 1 pot water to 1 pot Athonian Camoshade here. We don't want to be applying it too thickly, as it will obscure the colour too much and the details won't look realistic. They'll just look very, very dark in the recesses. And just a small amount, especially around the face where we've got some pronounced facial features like so, and anywhere we've painted skin in the previous steps. The final step in painting the skin is to pick out some of the final details using the Nurgling Green. I'm going to be focusing around the eyebrows here, really bring out some of these facial features around the nose. Just a small amount on the tip of my brush here can be used just very effectively just to pick out some of these highlighted edges. Mixing in some water as well will also help to control the paint, but also means that it won't be quite as harsh when it's applied to the flesh. So with the skin areas completed, we can now move on to painting some of the black cloth. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Dark Reaper, followed by a wash of Nuln Oil, before beginning some highlights, first of all with Russ Grey, and then finally Eshin Grey. Now even though Dark Reaper is not a base paint, it should cover really nicely over the grey primer that we've got here. You can see I'm just applying it across the cloth, making sure to be careful, especially around these areas where I've got skin as well. Now mixing in a small amount of water to thin down the paint will really help with the flow here. It also means you can apply a second coat once this first layer has been dried, and it gives a really nice and even coverage in which to build up from. So next up we're going to be washing over the dark cloth areas with Nuln Oil, and this will darken the colour a little bit and also pull into the recesses and give us some really enhanced details as well. So as you can see, I'm not applying it too heavily over the surface. I've mixed in roughly 1 pot water to 1 pot Nuln Oil for this step. And this just really helps us to get that definition we're looking for without darkening the colour too much. With the dark cloth area sufficiently darkened, we can now start highlighting the edges of the cloth. And first of all, we'll be using Russ Grey. Now this is a greyish blue colour. I'm just going to be dragging this along all the folds in the cloth. Anywhere we've got a hard edge, as you can see I'm doing here. Just a small amount of paint is needed on your brush for this step, and you want to lightly drag it across these surfaces, as you can see I'm doing here, and this just enhances the detail of the cloth. Now the final step in painting the black cloth is to pick out some of the more extreme corners and edges, this time using Eshin Grey. Now this will give us a much more pronounced look, so as you can see here I've got an intersection of several edges. I'm just applying a small amount just along the intersection. I'm also going to be focusing around some of the edges that are towards the top of the miniature. So for example, those that are around the sleeve here, we're just same again, just dragging the brush along the edge very carefully, and I've mixed in a small amount of water into this mixture as well, just to make it flow a little bit easier, and then if I do overspill, it's not a massive problem because it's only thinned down. So you want to do this across the entirety of the miniature, wherever you have any very harsh edges. With the dark cloth areas completed, I'll now be moving on to painting some of the leather areas. So this includes the straps that we've got here and the straps that are flowing off the surface here, and also some of the patches on the ball as well. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Rhinox Hide, followed by a highlight of Doombull Brown, before finally highlighting again with Straken Brown. So when painting the Rhinox Hide, you will want to just add a small amount of water into the mixture. It is a base paint, so it should cover really nicely, but still it's best to get 2 thin coats as opposed to 1 solid coat. Also avoids obscuring any details as well. So you can see here I'm just making sure I apply the Rhinox Hide across the entirety of these leather areas, and just be careful around areas that we've already painted. You don't want to overspill and ruin our paint job from previous steps. With the base coat of Rhinox Hide completed, we now want to use the Doombull Brown to pick out the edges of the leather areas that we painted in the previous steps. So you can see here I've got a small amount of paint on the tip of my brush. I'm just picking out all of these raised sections along this leather area. We want to keep the Rhinox Hide visible in the recesses, and that difference in colour will really enhance the details that we've got on the miniature here. Now the final step in painting the leather areas is to just pick out some of these very edges using the Straken Brown. You can see I'm only focusing more on these tattered edges of the leather. You can see around the waist here, just applying a small amount, and then what you can do as well is, if you have some a thin brush and a steady hand, you can actually apply some scuffs and scratches along the surface. This will create the effect of worn and damaged leather. I'll be doing this across the entirety of the miniature, picking out any harsh corners like so, and also applying the scratches and the damage. With the leather areas completed on the miniature, I'm next going to be painting the trousers that we've got here. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Rakar Flesh, followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia, and then we'll start to layer up the colour a little bit, first of all with a layer of Shabti Bone, before finally highlighting with White Scar. Rakar Flesh is a base paint, so it should cover really nicely over the Great Primer, but mixing in a small amount of water will really assist in getting this coverage really nice and even. So once this first layer has been applied and is thoroughly dried, we'll now be applying a second layer over the top, and this will give us the best coverage possible. With the Rakar Flesh base coat completed, we can now wash over the trousers here using the Seraphim Sepia. Now I've watered it down slightly, used 1 part water to 1 part Seraphim Sepia, and the reason for this is because we don't want the actual wash to darken the colour of the trousers too much. What we want it to do is to pull into the recesses and bring out some of those definitions and create some shading in these folds in the cloth. Now if you find that you've actually mixed in too much water, it's not a problem. Allow the first layer to dry and then just apply a second thin down layer over the top. Following the wash of Seraphim Sepia, we now want to build up the brightness and the lightness of the material of the trousers. I'm going to be using Shabti Bone mixed with some Lamy and Medium, and I've got them mixed together in roughly 1-to-1 quantities. And I'm going to be applying this over the surface of the trousers, leaving the darker sections of cloth still visible in the recesses. Now the reason why we mixed in the Lamy and Medium is because what we want to do is we want to create a nice transition between the 2 layers. So as you can see here, it actually applies quite thinly, and once this dries, it will be kind of a midway between the darker and the lighter, and then we apply a second coat over the top, and this time we'll focus mainly on these raised sections of cloth that you can see here, and this will create a really nice gradient between the 2 colours and give some really nice depth of detail on the trousers. Now the final step in painting the trousers is to apply a highlight of White Scar. And again, I've used some Lamy Medium, mixing in 1 part Lamy Medium to 1 part White Scar. And I'm going to be focusing this particular highlight along the actual folds themselves, just to really bring out the definition in the cloth here. You can see I'm just applying a thin line just along these edges. The Lamy Medium will make the transition a little bit smoother. It won't be quite as harsh if you applied it straight out of the pot. It'll be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more realistic. With the cloth areas completed, the next step is start painting the boots and also any nails and teeth and stitching on the miniature. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Avalon Sunset, followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia before finally highlighting with the Shabti Bone. So with the Avalon Sunset, we want to pick out a base coat for the teeth. We're going to be applying this over the entirety of the teeth. Mixing in a small amount of water will really help in the application here, but just be careful not to overspill onto the rest of the face. Same goes for when you're painting the nails and also the boots and stitching as well. With the Avalon Sunset base coat completed, we can now start washing over the areas we painted in the previous step using Seraphim Sepia. Now this will really bring out some of the detailing here. You can see as I apply it over the teeth, it's pulling into the recesses and enhancing the definition of the teeth you can see there. Now this will give us a nice kind of dirty bone effect, as you can see as I apply it in there. We'll also be applying this across the other areas that we painted yellow, such as the boots as well, the stitching, and then also any nails on the miniature as well. The final step in painting the teeth and other yellow areas is to highlight them using a Ushabti bone. Now over the teeth we're going to be focusing quite a large proportion of the tooth we'll be painting with the Ushabti bone. This will give us the bone colour we're looking for, and just the kind of the dirty plaque build-up in the recesses of the teeth. The same goes for the nails as well. We want just to pick out the tips in this case, and just gives us this dirty bone coloured nail as well. Then when we actually come to paint the stitching, we only want to apply a small amount this time, mainly focusing towards the top edges, like so, and this just gives the effect of almost like a yarn or a thick hemp thread that's been used to assemble these items. The next area we have left to paint are the black areas. This includes some of the armor panels. There isn't any on this particular miniature, but some of the larger orcs do have black armor panels. And also the trim along the boots as well. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Abaddon Black, followed by a first highlight of Mechanicus Standard Grey, before applying a final highlight of Dawnstone. Using the Abaddon Black, I'll now be picking out the trim on the boots that we've got here. Just being careful not to overspill onto the yellow areas that we painted in the previous step. Using a thin brush will really help with this, as well as mixing in a small amount of water just to improve the flow and control the paint off the brush. Following the coat of Abaddon Black, we can now begin by highlighting the edges of the black areas. First of all, we're using the Mechanicus Standard Grey, just running the brush along the edges of the trim that we've got here, just very gently, just getting a thin line, like so. Mixing in again a small amount of water just to improve the flow here and make the paint easier to control. The final step in painting the black areas is to pick out some of the corners of the black areas using the Dawnstone. We just want to apply a small amount on these corners. This will just really enhance some of the detailing that we've got going on the black areas. With the black areas completed, the next step is to paint the red areas of the miniature. Now in this particular throw, it's going to be all of the armor panels and also this final patch of skin that's being used to make up the ball. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Mephiston Red, followed by a wash of Nurgling Oil before starting a layer of Evilson Scarlet, and then finally a highlight of Wild Rider Red. As Mephiston Red is a base paint, it should cover really nicely over the grey primer that we started off with. But I've mixed in some water, you can see as I apply it over here. It's quite a thin coat, so what will happen is, once this layer has thoroughly dried, I'll then be applying a second thin down layer over the top. And this will give us a really nice, rich red colour that we can build up from. With the base coat applied, the red armor is looking very vibrant, but we want to bring down the colour a little bit and also pick out some of the detailing in the armor as well. So we're going to be washing over it now with a Nurgling Oil wash. Now I've watered this down quite a lot because we don't want to be applying it too strongly, because it will just make the red areas far too dark than we want. So I've mixed in roughly 1 part water to 1 part Nurgling Oil. I'll be spreading this across the entire miniature wherever I've painted the red armor. With the Nurgling Oil wash dry, the next step is to apply the Evilson Scarlet as a layer over the red armor. Now I've mixed in some Lamium Medium here, 1 part Lamium Medium to 1 part Evilson Scarlet, and this will create a watered down, thinned down glaze over the surface here. So what I'm doing is I'm not going to be very uniform in my application of this paint. We want it to look slapdash painted armor. This is Orcs after all. I'm just going to be applying this across the surfaces, focusing on these large panels especially. And I'm using a motion that's going perpendicular to the actual armor itself, and this creates this nice streaky effect. Looks like it's been painted as opposed to professionally painted, so to speak. So I'm just very lightly applying it over the surface. I'll be doing this across all of the red armor areas on the miniature. The final step in painting the red armor is to highlight all of the edges using the Wild Rider Red. You can see here I'm just using a small brush with just a small amount of paint on the end. I'm very carefully dragging this brush along these edges here, and this will really just enhance the effect of the red. It will really bring out these details as well. You see I'm just applying a small amount. It's all you need just to apply along these edges. With the red armor completed, we'll now be moving on to painting some markings on the armor and also the clothing as well. Now we'll be using Abaddon Black and White Scar for this. So first of all, we'll be using Abaddon Black to mark out some of the markings on the armor and the cloth as well. So we'll be applying some stripes down the side of the cloth on the legs here, just be starting roughly around the middle and just applying a very thin line, working our way down the cloth like so. But also be applying some checkerboard patterns onto the actual armour itself. So we're going to be focusing mainly around this knee here. Now what we want to do is to apply some vertical lines first, followed by some horizontal lines second. The next step after painting the black markings is to paint some of the white ones. Now this can be a little bit tricky painting white over a dark colour such as the red here, but what we're going to do is going to be applying 2 thin down layers. Now what we do first is we want to achieve some stripes that are going down the actual armour panels themselves. So I'm going to be applying a thin line like so, but I'm not going to be actually applying a solid line. I'm going to be applying a couple of little breaks and scuffs in there because we want to give the illusion that the armour is scuffed and damaged and the paint is peeling off. Just very carefully here, just applying the line along, just building up over a couple of layers. I'll leave this layer to dry and then paint over it again. And you see it gives us the effect that there's a line painted down there that's been scuffed over damage. Now again, when we actually come to paint the checkerboards, we now want to fill in the squares that we painted in the last section. You can see there we've got 3 squares, so we want to paint the alternate squares again using the same technique as before, just building the layers slowly, leaving some gaps in there as well to represent paint that's chipped off. Now with the markings completed, the next step is to add some wear and tear and scuffs to the armour. Now we'll be using, first of all, Eshin Grey and then also some Corn Red as well. Now we'll be applying this across the decals, so I'd recommend applying the decals before you move on to this step, and also just across the armour plates on the miniature. For this step, instead of using a brush, I'm instead of using a piece of sponge here, and I've dipped it in the Eshin Grey. I'm going to be applying this along the edges of the armour, just dabbing it on. It will create these scuff marks you can see here. We can even apply some over the decals as well. Just all add up to create some scuff marks on the paint. You don't want to apply too many at this stage, you don't want to overdo it, but you want to mainly focus around areas you would expect damage to occur, so such as the knee pad and also the edges of the armour. For the next step, I'll be using Corn Red on the decals that we applied in the previous step, and I'm going to be applying this over the actual white areas. You can see here what this creates is the effect that the paint has been chipped off. You can see it there on the 2 I've painted around, and we want to basically rough up these edges, sometimes actually adding in full breaks between the lines, other times just adding a small scuff across the surface. And we'll be applying this across the miniature wherever we've got any decals applied. Now the final step in painting our Blood Bowl thrower is to paint the metallic areas. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Lead Belcher, followed by a wash of Agrax Earthshade, before finally highlighting with Stormhost Silver. Using the Lead Belcher, we want to paint over all of the metallic areas on the miniature. Now on this particular thrower, it's going to be the metal toe cap on the boot here. There's also the panel at the top, the earring, the spikes on the ball, and any other buckles or other items you may find on the miniature which could be made from metal. And the Lead Belcher is a base paint, so it should cover really nicely over the grey primer, but mixing in just a small amount of water, as we've done in previous steps, will really assist in the flow of this paint. Now whenever you're painting a metallic paint, just be extra careful not to overspill onto the areas we've already painted, as it can be quite difficult to paint over it with non-metallic colours. So now that we have a base layer on the metal areas, we can now wash over them using Agrax Earthshade. Now this will dirty down the metal as well as giving it a rusty effect as well. So I'm just applying the Agrax Earthshade over the top here, and I'm going to be applying a couple of thin down coats because I want to create in some areas just a very subtle browning of the metal. Other areas I want to be a little bit heavier in its application, but always whenever you're applying the wash, try not to overspill onto the areas that we've already painted. The final step in painting the metal areas is to use the Stormhost Silver to, first of all, highlight the metal areas just to bring out a little bit more shine in them. Now when you're highlighting, you don't need to be too precise or too exacting, because at the end of the day we want to give the effect that this metal has been dirtied and rusted, but then it's also got sharp edges as well. So I'm going to be running the brush along the edges of the metal areas like so. Again, don't worry, have to worry too much about making sure that you get things nice and neat. And then once you've done this, you can also start adding some metal scuffs to the armour itself. So for example, along these edges here, I'm just going to be applying some small flakes of metal. And this just gives the effect that the paint has been peeled away, revealing the bare metal underneath. And here we have the finished Orc Blood Bowl thrower, who you can see I've also based. Now whilst I focused on the Orc thrower, the exact same techniques and paints could be applied to any of the team members. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please do let me know in the comments below, and also hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with all of my future content. To be kept up to date with the projects that I'm currently working on, check out my Facebook page, which you can find a link to in the description. And if you would like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can also find a link to in the description. From there, you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which just really help me in producing future content. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.